The winter wind cut through Abigail Taylor's worn wool coat like 1,000 tiny blades as she stumbled through the snow-covered prairie outside Fort Kearney, Nebraska, her tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall to the ground. She had been walking for hours, ever since she discovered her brother's lifeless body in the barn that morning, a victim of the fever that had been sweeping through their homestead for weeks. First her mother, then her father, and now Benjamin. At 21 years old, Abigail found herself completely alone in the world, with nothing but a failing farm that the bank would surely claim within the month. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe, and she had simply walked away from everything, needing to escape the suffocating walls of that house filled with ghosts and memories. The December afternoon was fading fast, the pale sun already dipping toward the horizon, turning the snow-covered landscape shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful if Abigail could have seen anything through her tears. Her feet were numb inside her worn boots, and she had lost feeling in her fingers an hour ago, but she kept walking because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant facing the unbearable truth that she was utterly and completely alone. She did not hear the horse approaching until it was nearly upon her. The sound of hooves crunching through the crusty snow finally penetrated her grief-fogged mind, and she turned to see a tall figure on horseback emerging from the golden light of the setting sun. The rider pulled his mount to a stop a few feet away, and Abigail could make out the silhouette of a man in a heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat. "Madam, are you all right?" His voice was deep and carried a note of genuine concern. "You should not be out here alone. Storm is coming in tonight." Abigail tried to speak, but her throat was raw from crying and her lips were cracked from the cold. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, a fresh wave of grief crashed over her, and she felt her knees buckle. The world tilted sideways, and she was vaguely aware of the man dismounting in a hurry, his boots hitting the snow with a soft thump. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground, and Abigail found herself being held against a broad chest. The warmth of another human being after the cold loneliness of the past few weeks was too much to bear, and she began to sob in earnest, great heaving cries that shook her entire body. She tried to pull away, mortified at her loss of control in front of a stranger, but the arms around her only tightened. "Easy now," the man said, his voice rumbling through his chest where her cheek pressed against the rough wool of his coat. "You are all right. I have got you." But Abigail was not all right, and the kindness in his voice only made her cry harder. She could not remember the last time someone had held her or spoken to her with such gentleness. It had been months since her family fell ill, and she had spent every day and night caring for them, watching them slip away one by one despite her desperate efforts to save them. The cowboy shifted his grip, pulling her even closer, and Abigail felt one of his large hands come up to cradle the back of her head. She should have been embarrassed, should have pulled herself together and thanked him politely before sending him on his way, but she found she could not stop crying. The grief poured out of her like water from a broken dam, and she clung to this stranger as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had crumbled to dust beneath her feet. "That is it," he murmured, his breath warm against her hair. "Cry until you are empty. I will fill you up." The words were so unexpected, so tender, that Abigail felt something crack open inside her chest. She cried for her mother's gentle smile and her father's booming laugh. She cried for Benjamin, who had been only 18 and should have had his whole life ahead of him. She cried for the little girl she had been, running through wheat fields without a care in the world, and for the woman she had become, hardened by loss and responsibility before her time. She did not know how long they stood there in the snow, this stranger holding her while she fell apart in his arms. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in deeper shades of orange and purple, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of the storm he had mentioned. Finally, when her tears began to subside and her sobs quieted to hiccuping gasps, Abigail became aware of just how inappropriate this situation was. She was standing in the middle of the prairie, wrapped in the arms of a man whose face she had not even seen. She pulled back slightly, and the cowboy loosened his grip enough to let her move but kept his hands on her shoulders, steadying her. Abigail looked up and found herself staring into the most striking pair of gray eyes she had ever seen. They were the color of storm clouds, rimmed with dark lashes, and they regarded her with such warmth and concern that she felt her cheeks flush despite the cold. The man was perhaps 25 or 26, with strong features tanned from long hours in the sun, and a jaw covered in several days' worth of dark stubble. A lock of black hair had escaped from beneath his hat and fell across his forehead. He was handsome in a rugged, weathered way that spoke of hard work and honest living. "I am sorry," Abigail managed to whisper, her voice hoarse. "I do not usually fall apart on strangers." "No need to apologize," he said, his hands still resting on her shoulders. "We all need somebody to catch us sometimes. I am Yates Tucker. My ranch is about 3 miles east of here." "Abigail Taylor," she replied automatically, then added, "My family's farm is back that way." She gestured vaguely over her shoulder, unable to bring herself to call it her farm even though that was what it was now. Yates studied her face for a long moment, and Abigail wondered what he saw there. Her eyes must be red and swollen from crying, her nose was probably running from the cold, and she knew her blonde hair had come loose from its braid and was hanging in tangled strands around her face. She must look like a complete mess. "Miss Taylor, I do not mean to be forward, but you look about ready to collapse. My ranch is closer than town, and my housekeeper can get you warmed up and fed. Whatever has happened, it will still be there tomorrow, but you need to take care of yourself right now." Abigail knew she should refuse, should insist on making her own way back to the farm or into Fort Kearney, but the thought of returning to that empty house filled with death and memories made her stomach turn. And she was so tired, bone-deep exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the weight she had been carrying for months. "I do not want to be a burden," she said weakly. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew she was going to accept his offer. She simply had nowhere else to go and no strength left to pretend she could manage on her own. "You are not a burden," Yates said firmly. He released her shoulders and turned to his horse, a large chestnut gelding that had been standing patiently during their exchange. "Come on. You can ride and I will walk. It is not far." Before Abigail could protest, he had his hands on her waist and was lifting her into the saddle with an ease that spoke of considerable strength. She grabbed the saddle horn to steady herself, her frozen fingers clumsy and uncoordinated. Yates gathered the reins and began leading the horse east, setting a brisk pace that would get them to shelter before full dark. They walked in silence, and Abigail found herself swaying slightly in the saddle, lulled by the rhythmic movement and the exhaustion that pulled at every fiber of her being. She watched Yates's broad back as he walked ahead of her, one hand on the horse's bridle, the other resting casually at his side. There was something inherently trustworthy about him, something in the calm confidence of his movements and the gentleness he had shown her that made her feel safe for the first time in months. The Tucker ranch materialized out of the gathering dusk like something from a dream. It was modest but well-maintained, with a sturdy house built of timber and stone, a large barn and several outbuildings. Warm light glowed in the windows of the house, and smoke curled from the chimney into the darkening sky. Abigail felt tears prick her eyes again at the sight of it. This place that looked like a home in a way her own house had not felt in a very long time. Yates tied his horse to the hitching post and reached up to help Abigail dismount. Her legs nearly gave out when her feet hit the ground, and he caught her again, that same steady grip that had held her together on the prairie. "I have got you," he said again, and Abigail found herself believing him. He guided her up the steps to the porch and pushed open the front door, ushering her into blessed warmth. The interior of the house was simple but comfortable, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall of the main room. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, and the smell of something savory cooking made Abigail's stomach growl despite her grief. An older woman emerged from what must have been the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 50, with graying brown hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes that took in Abigail's disheveled appearance with concern. "Good heavens, Yates, who is this poor child?" the woman exclaimed, hurrying forward. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Miss Abigail Taylor. I found her walking on the prairie. She needs warming up and looking after. Can you help her while I see to the horses?" Of course," Mrs. Henderson said, already taking charge. She wrapped a firm arm around Abigail's waist and began steering her toward the fireplace. "Come sit down, dear. You are frozen half to death. Yates, bring some blankets from the spare room before you go." Yates disappeared down a hallway and returned a moment later with several thick quilts. He handed them to Mrs. Henderson, his eyes meeting Abigail's briefly before he headed back outside. There was something in that look, a promise perhaps, that he would return and that she was not alone anymore. Mrs. Henderson settled Abigail in a chair close to the fire and wrapped her in the quilts, then bustled off to the kitchen. She returned with a steaming mug of tea, pressing it into Abigail's hands despite her protests that she could not possibly impose further. "Nonsense," Mrs. Henderson said briskly. "You drink that tea and warm yourself up. I will get some stew for you. You look like you have not eaten a proper meal in weeks." She was right, of course. Abigail could not remember the last time she had eaten anything more substantial than bread and whatever vegetables she could find in the root cellar. Cooking for one person had seemed pointless, and she had been too tired and heartsick to bother most days. The warmth of the fire and the hot tea began to penetrate the cold that had settled into her bones, and Abigail felt some of the numbness start to recede. With it came the full awareness of her situation and the crushing embarrassment of having broken down so completely in front of a stranger. What must Yates Tucker think of her? And what was she doing here in his house, accepting his charity when she had no way to repay it? Mrs. Henderson returned with a bowl of thick beef stew and a slice of fresh bread, setting them on a small table beside Abigail's chair. "Now you eat every bite of that," she instructed. "I am going to heat some water so you can wash up if you like. The spare room is all made up and you will stay the night. No arguments." "I could not possibly," Abigail began, but Mrs. Henderson held up a hand. "You could and you will. It will be dark soon and that storm is coming in. No one with any sense would send a young woman out in this weather. Besides, Yates would have my hide if I let you leave before you were properly rested and fed." Abigail wanted to argue, but the fight had gone out of her. She picked up the spoon and began to eat, and the first bite of hot, savory stew was so good that she nearly wept again. She had not realized how hungry she was until the food was in front of her. Yates returned as she was finishing her meal, stamping the snow from his boots and hanging his coat and hat by the door. Without the heavy winter gear, Abigail could see that he was even taller than she had thought, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscled build of someone who made his living through physical labor. He crossed the room to warm his hands by the fire, giving Abigail a small smile. "Feeling better?" he asked. "Yes, thank you," Abigail said. "You and Mrs. Henderson have been very kind. I am grateful, but I should not impose on you any longer. I can make my way back to Fort Kearney." "In the dark with a storm coming?" Yates shook his head. "I do not think so. You will stay here tonight where it is safe and warm, and tomorrow we can figure out what comes next." There was no arguing with the firmness in his voice, and truthfully, Abigail did not have the energy to try. She nodded, setting down her empty bowl. "Would you like to talk about what had you walking alone on the prairie in the middle of winter?" Yates asked gently, settling into the chair across from her. Abigail stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. Part of her wanted to keep it all locked inside, but another part, the part that was so tired of carrying everything alone, wanted desperately to share the burden. "My brother died this morning," she said quietly. "He was the last. My mother passed 6 weeks ago and my father 3 weeks after that. They all had the fever." She heard Yates draw in a sharp breath. "Miss Taylor, I am so sorry. That is a terrible loss." "I tried everything," Abigail continued, the words spilling out now that she had started. "I nursed them day and night, tried every remedy I knew, even brought the doctor out from town though we could not afford it. Nothing helped. They just got weaker and weaker until they were gone." "You did everything you could," Yates said. "Sometimes things are beyond our control, no matter how hard we fight." "The farm is going to the bank," Abigail said. "We were already behind on payments, and without my father and brother to work it, there is no way I can manage alone. I have no other family, no place to go. I was walking today because I could not stand to be in that house anymore, surrounded by all those memories and knowing I had failed them all." "You did not fail anyone," Yates said firmly. "You did what you could with what you had. That is all any of us can do." Abigail finally looked at him, meeting those gray eyes that seemed to see right through her. "Why did you stop today? Most people would have ridden past a strange woman walking alone." "I could not do that," Yates said simply. "My mother raised me better than to leave someone in need. Besides, I know what it is like to feel alone in the world. My parents died when I was 19, killed by raiders on the trail west. I was left with a half-built ranch and a lot of debt, and there were days I was not sure I would make it through." "How did you manage?" Abigail asked. "Stubbornness mostly," Yates said with a slight smile. "And the help of good people like Mrs. Henderson and her husband. They worked for my father and they stayed on to help me even when I could barely pay them. They became the family I had lost. Sometimes the family we choose is just as important as the one we are born into." Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, carrying a pile of clean clothes. "The water is hot if you want to wash up, dear. I brought you a nightgown and a dress for tomorrow." "They were my daughters before she married and moved to California. You look to be about her size." Abigail stood, clutching the quilts around her shoulders. "Thank you for everything. I do not know how I will ever repay your kindness." "No repayment needed," Mrs. Henderson said warmly. "Now come along. A good night's sleep will do you a world of good." Abigail followed the older woman down the hallway to a small but comfortable bedroom. A copper tub had been placed near the small fireplace, steam rising from the hot water. The bed was made up with clean linens, and someone had placed a vase of dried wildflowers on the bedside table. "You take your time," Mrs. Henderson said. "If you need anything, I am just down the hall. Sleep as late as you need in the morning." When she was alone, Abigail shed her dirty, tear-stained clothes and sank into the hot water with a sigh of relief. The heat, eased the tension from her muscles and soothed her raw emotions. She scrubbed herself clean, washing away the grime and the lingering scent of sickness and death that had clung to her for weeks. By the time she climbed into bed wearing the borrowed nightgown, she was so exhausted that she fell asleep almost immediately, despite the turmoil of her thoughts. For the first time in weeks, she slept without nightmares, her body finally able to rest now that someone else was watching over her. She woke to pale winter sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of bacon cooking. For a moment, she was disoriented, not recognizing the unfamiliar room. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, and with them, a complicated tangle of emotions. Grief for her family, shame at her breakdown, gratitude for Yates Tucker's kindness, and underneath it all, a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. The dress Mrs. Henderson had left for her was a simple blue cotton, practical and warm. It fit reasonably well, though it was a bit loose in places. Abigail braided her hair as best she could without a mirror, then made her way to the main room, following the sounds and smells of breakfast being prepared. Yates was already seated at the large wooden table, a cup of coffee in his hands. He stood when she entered, a gesture of old-fashioned manners that made her heart squeeze unexpectedly. "Good morning, Miss Taylor. I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," Abigail admitted. "And please call me Abigail. After yesterday, formality seems a bit unnecessary." "Then you must call me Yates," he said with a smile that transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. Mrs. Henderson bustled in with plates of bacon, eggs, and biscuits, shooing them both to sit down and eat. The meal was delicious, and Abigail found herself eating more than she had in weeks, her appetite returning along with her strength. "I have been thinking about your situation," Yates said as they finished eating. "I know this might seem forward, but I have a proposition for you." Abigail set down her fork, her heart suddenly beating faster. "What kind of proposition?" "I need help around the ranch. Mrs. Henderson manages the house beautifully, but her husband is getting older and the work is getting to be too much for him. I have been thinking about hiring someone to help with the lighter chores, the cooking, the garden in spring. The position would come with room and board and a small salary. It would not be much, but it would be honest work and a place to stay." Abigail stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You would hire me? You do not even know me." "I know enough," Yates said. "I know you are a hard worker. Anyone who nursed 3 family members through a deadly fever and kept a farm running is not afraid of hard work. I know you are brave. It takes courage to keep going when everything falls apart around you. And I know you need a place to go and I need help. Seems like we could help each other." "I do not want charity," Abigail said carefully, her pride warring with her desperate need for exactly what he was offering. "It is not charity. It is a job. I will expect you to work and earn your keep. But you will have a roof over your head and food in your belly, and you will not have to face the world alone." Abigail felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude rather than grief. "I accept. Thank you, Yates. You will not regret it." "I am sure I will not," he said, and the warmth in his eyes made her feel like maybe, just maybe, things might be all right after all. Over the next few weeks, Abigail settled into life on the Tucker ranch. She worked alongside Mrs. Henderson, learning the rhythms of the household and taking on more responsibilities each day. She helped with the cooking and cleaning, mended clothes, and began planning the garden they would plant when spring came. The work was hard, but it was satisfying in a way that soothed her grieving heart. Yates was a constant, steady presence. He was up before dawn every morning to tend the horses and cattle, working long hours even in the bitter cold of January. He treated Abigail with unfailing courtesy and respect, never mentioning her breakdown that first day, but also never making her feel like she had to hide her grief. When she had bad days, when the sorrow would wash over her unexpectedly, he simply gave her space and time to feel what she needed to feel. But as the weeks passed, Abigail found herself thinking about him more and more. She noticed the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the deep rumble of his laugh when Mrs. Henderson told funny stories at dinner, the gentleness with which he handled the horses and the other animals. She noticed the way her heart would skip a beat when he walked into a room, the way she found herself looking for excuses to be near him. She told herself it was just gratitude, that any woman in her position would feel drawn to the man who had quite literally saved her life. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. She was falling in love with Yates Tucker, and the realization terrified her. It was late February when everything changed. Abigail had been at the ranch for nearly 2 months, and the worst of the winter was beginning to ease. The days were growing longer, and there was a subtle shift in the air that promised spring would come eventually. She was in the kitchen one afternoon, kneading bread dough, when Yates came in through the back door. His face was troubled, and Abigail felt her stomach clench with worry. "What is wrong?" she asked, wiping her floury hands on her apron. "Received word from town today," Yates said, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "The bank is selling your family's farm at auction next week. I thought you should know." Abigail felt the familiar ache of grief, but also a strange sense of relief. She had known this was coming, had been expecting it since the day she left. "I suppose I am not surprised. There was no way I could have kept it. Are you all right?" Yates asked, studying her face. "I think so," Abigail said slowly. "It hurts to lose the place where I grew up, but it stopped feeling like home a long time ago. This place feels more like home now than that farm ever did after my family died." Something flickered in Yates's eyes at her words, something that made her pulse quicken. He took a step closer, then seemed to think better of it and stopped. "Abigail, there is something I need to tell you. Something I have been wanting to say for weeks now, but I did not want to take advantage of your situation or make you feel obligated in any way." Abigail's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "What is it?" "I have come to care for you," Yates said, the words coming out in a rush as if he had been holding them back for too long. "More than I should, probably. More than is proper for an employer. You came here needing help and a place to stay, and I do not want you to think I expect anything in return for giving you that. But I cannot keep pretending I do not feel what I feel. You are the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I have ever met, and I am falling in love with you. I think I have been since the moment I found you crying on that prairie." Abigail stood frozen, the words she had been longing to hear washing over her like warm rain. "You love me," she whispered. "I do," Yates said, "but I understand if you do not feel the same way. You have been through so much loss, and maybe it is too soon. I just needed you to know the truth." "Yates," Abigail said, crossing the distance between them in 3 quick steps. "I love you too. I have been falling in love with you since you held me while I cried and told me you would fill me up. You have done exactly that. You have filled all the empty, broken places inside me with hope and joy, and the belief that I could have a future worth living." The smile that broke across Yates's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. He reached for her, pulling her into his arms, and Abigail went willingly, pressing herself against his solid warmth. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she had not realized had fallen. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Please," Abigail breathed. His lips met hers in a kiss that was tender and passionate all at once, full of promise and longing and the joy of two souls finding each other. Abigail felt like she was falling and flying all at the same time, held safe in the arms of this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast, and I know I should probably court you properly first, but I do not want to wait. I want to spend every day of the rest of my life with you. I want to build a future together, fill this house with love and laughter and maybe children someday if God wills it. Say yes, Abigail. Please say yes." Abigail pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, those beautiful gray eyes that had seen her at her lowest and loved her anyway. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you, Yates Tucker. Nothing would make me happier." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Abigail lost herself in the sensation of being loved and wanted and cherished. When they heard Mrs. Henderson clearing her throat pointedly from the doorway, they broke apart, both blushing like teenagers. "Well, Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes twinkling with amusement and pleasure, "I suppose this means we will be having a wedding soon." "The sooner the better," Yates said, grinning, "if Abigail is agreeable." "I am very agreeable," Abigail said, unable to stop smiling. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Fort Kearney. It was a simple ceremony attended by Mrs. Henderson and her husband, a few of Yates's ranch hands, and some of the townspeople who had known Abigail's family. She wore a dress that Mrs. Henderson had altered from her own wedding gown, and she carried a small bouquet of early wildflowers that Yates had ridden out to find for her. As she stood beside Yates and spoke her vows, promising to love and honor him for all the days of her life, Abigail felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she was meant to be, with this man who had caught her when she was falling and held her until she could stand on her own again. This was her new beginning, the life she had never imagined she could have rising from the ashes of everything she had lost. That night, in the bedroom that was now theirs to share, Yates held her close and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache in the best possible way. He undressed her slowly, reverently, his hands gentle as they explored her body for the first time. Abigail had been nervous about the marriage bed, but with Yates, everything felt natural and right. He made love to her with patience and care, taking his time to ensure her pleasure before seeking his own. Afterward, they lay tangled together beneath the quilts, listening to the wind howl outside while they stayed warm and safe in their own little world. "I love you, Mrs. Tucker," Yates murmured against her hair. "I love you too," Abigail whispered back, and for the first time since her family died, she felt complete. Spring came to Nebraska in a rush of green and gold, the prairie transforming from a barren white landscape to rolling hills of grass and wildflowers. Abigail threw herself into planting the garden, working beside Mrs. Henderson to put in vegetables and herbs that would feed them through the next winter. Her hands grew calloused and strong, and her face took on a healthy glow from hours spent in the sun. Yates expanded the ranch, buying more cattle and hiring additional hands to help manage them. The work was hard, but the ranch was prospering, and there was a sense of optimism in the air. Abigail loved watching her husband work, admiring his strength and skill, the easy way he had with the animals and the men who worked for him. At night, they would sit on the porch together, watching the sun set over the prairie and talking about their dreams for the future. Yates wanted to build a bigger barn and maybe expand the house someday. Abigail wanted to start a small business selling her preserves and baked goods in town. They both wanted children, a house full of them to fill the empty spaces and carry on the legacy they were building together. Summer arrived hot and dry, and Abigail found herself constantly tired, her energy sapped by the heat. She also noticed that her monthly courses had not come, and a flutter of hope and excitement began to build in her chest. Could she be with child? It seemed almost too wonderful to be true. Mrs. Henderson noticed her fatigue and the way she sometimes turned pale and nauseous in the mornings. One day in early July, the older woman pulled Abigail aside and asked her gently if she might be expecting. "I think I might be," Abigail admitted. "I have been feeling strange for weeks, but I did not want to say anything until I was sure." "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Henderson said, pulling her into a warm embrace. "That is wonderful news. Have you told Yates?" "Not yet. I wanted to be certain before I got his hopes up. You need to see the doctor in town, but I have delivered enough babies in my time to know the signs. I would bet my best skillet that you are going to be a mother come spring." That evening, after supper, Abigail asked Yates to walk with her. They strolled out past the barn to the small rise where they could see the whole ranch spread out before them in the golden evening light. "Yates, I have something to tell you," Abigail said, her heart hammering in her chest. He turned to look at her, concern flickering across his face. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am more than all right," Abigail said, taking his hands in hers. "I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Yates just stared at her as if he could not quite comprehend what she had said. Then his face broke into the widest, most joyful smile she had ever seen. He let out a whoop of happiness and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until she was laughing and begging him to put her down before they both fell over. "A baby," he kept saying, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Abigail asked, though she could already see the answer written all over his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Yates said, setting her gently back on her feet and cradling her face in his hands. "You have given me everything I ever wanted. A home, a family, a reason to wake up every morning with joy in my heart. I love you so much, Abigail." "I love you too," she said, and he kissed her there on the hillside as the sun set and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The months of her pregnancy passed in a blur of preparations and growing excitement. Yates insisted on doing most of the heavy work around the house, refusing to let Abigail strain herself. Mrs. Henderson helped her sew tiny gowns and blankets, and Yates built a beautiful cradle from oak wood, sanding it smooth and carving little flowers into the sides. As her belly grew round and heavy, Abigail often thought about her mother and wished desperately that she could have been there to see her become a mother herself. But she also felt her family's presence in other ways, in the memories that no longer hurt quite as much, in the stories she would one day tell her child about the grandparents they would never meet. Winter came again, and with it, the baby. On a snowy night in late February, almost exactly a year after Yates had found her crying on the prairie, Abigail went into labor. Mrs. Henderson and the doctor from town attended her, while Yates paced anxiously in the main room, wearing a path in the floorboards. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Abigail was not sure she had the strength to continue. But then she would think of Yates and the life they had built together, and she would find the will to push through the pain. Finally, as dawn was breaking over the prairie, her son came into the world with a lusty cry that announced his arrival to everyone within earshot. "You have a boy," Mrs. Henderson said, placing the squalling infant on Abigail's chest. "A healthy, strong boy." Abigail looked down at her son, this tiny perfect being with his father's dark hair and a pair of eyes that would probably turn gray like Yates's. She felt a rush of love so intense it nearly overwhelmed her, a fierce, protective instinct that she knew would last the rest of her life. "Yates," she called weakly. Come meet your son." The door burst open and Yates rushed in, his face pale with worry until he saw Abigail smiling and holding their baby. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and sank down on the edge of the bed beside them. "He is perfect," Yates whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand. Those little fingers immediately wrapped around his much larger one, and Abigail saw tears spring to her husband's eyes. "What should we name him?" Abigail asked. Yates was quiet for a moment, looking at his son with an expression of such love and wonder that it made Abigail's heart squeeze. "Benjamin," he said finally, "after your brother, if that is all right with you." Fresh tears spilled down Abigail's cheeks, but they were good tears, healing tears. "Benjamin Tucker," she said. "It is perfect." The first year of Benjamin's life passed in a happy chaos of sleepless nights and precious moments. He was a good baby, healthy and happy, with his father's calm temperament and his mother's bright curiosity. Abigail loved watching Yates with their son, seeing the gentle way he held the infant, the patience with which he soothed him when he cried, the pride that shone in his eyes every time he looked at his child. As Benjamin grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. Yates hired more men and expanded his herd, and Abigail started selling her preserves and baked goods in town, developing a reputation for quality that had customers coming from miles around. They saved their money carefully, planning for the future and the more children they hoped to have. When Benjamin was 2 years old, Abigail found herself pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and when her daughter was born on a warm spring morning, the delivery was much quicker than her first. "A girl," the doctor announced, handing the baby to Abigail. "And she looks just like her mother." It was true. Their daughter had Abigail's blonde hair and blue eyes, and when she smiled, which was often, she had dimples just like Abigail's had been when she was young. "What shall we call her?" Yates asked, sitting on the bed with Benjamin on his lap, the toddler peering curiously at his new sister. "Anna," Abigail said, "after my mother, Anna Elizabeth Tucker." "Hello, Anna Elizabeth," Yates said softly, leaning over to kiss his daughter's forehead. "Welcome to the family." The years that followed were full and rich, blessed with the kind of happiness that Abigail had once thought she would never know again. 2 more children came, another boy they named Samuel, and a second daughter they called Rose. The house rang with the sounds of children's laughter and the patter of little feet, exactly as Yates had dreamed that day he proposed. Mrs. Henderson and her husband eventually retired to a small cottage on the edge of the property, though they still came to the main house often to visit and help with the grandchildren, as they called them. The ranch continued to grow and thrive, becoming one of the most successful in the region. On winter evenings, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Abigail and Yates would sit by the fire, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest. They would talk about their day, make plans for tomorrow, and sometimes just sit in comfortable silence, content simply to be together. "You ever think about that day I found you on the prairie?" Yates asked one night, his fingers idly playing with a strand of her hair. "Sometimes," Abigail admitted. "It feels like a lifetime ago and yesterday all at once. I was so lost that day, so certain that I had nothing left to live for." "I am glad I found you," Yates said. "I am glad you let me help you." "You did more than help me," Abigail said, tilting her head to look up at him. "You saved me. You took all my broken pieces and helped me put them back together into something even better than they were before. You filled me up with love and purpose and hope. You gave me a family and a home and a life worth living." "We saved each other," Yates said, leaning down to kiss her gently. "I was so lonely before you came. I did not even realize how much I needed someone until I held you in my arms and knew I never wanted to let go." "Well, you are stuck with me now," Abigail said with a smile, "for better or worse, until death do us part." "I cannot think of anything I would rather be stuck with," Yates replied and kissed her again. As the years passed, their love only grew stronger. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, sick children and difficult harvests, but they faced everything together, side by side, partners in every sense of the word. They watched their children grow strong and healthy, taught them to work hard and treat others with kindness, and filled their home with laughter and love. Benjamin grew into a serious young man with his father's skill with horses and his mother's head for business. By the time he was 18, he was managing much of the day-to-day operations of the ranch, freeing Yates to focus on expansion and planning for the future. Anna inherited her mother's love of baking and her father's charm, and she could often be found in the kitchen experimenting with new recipes or charming customers in the small shop they had opened in town. Samuel was the dreamer of the family, always with his nose in a book, talking about going to university back east and becoming a lawyer. And Rose, the baby, was fearless and wild, more comfortable on horseback than anywhere else, determined to prove she could do anything her brothers could do. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised Abigail with a trip away from the ranch. Mrs. Henderson agreed to watch the children for a few days, and they rode out to a small cabin Yates had built on the far edge of their property, near a stream where wildflowers grew thick in the summer. It was early June, and the prairie was at its most beautiful, rolling hills of green grass dotted with colorful blooms. They spent 3 glorious days alone together, swimming in the cold stream, lying in the sun, and making love like they were young newlyweds again, instead of a married couple approaching 40 with 4 children and a ranch to run. On their last evening there, they sat outside the cabin watching the sunset, wrapped in a blanket together. Abigail thought about how far they had come, how much life they had lived together in 15 years. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" Yates asked. "For stopping that day. For not riding past a strange woman crying on the prairie. For holding me when I fell apart and promising to fill me up. For keeping that promise every single day since." "I should be thanking you," Yates said. "You brought life and joy and meaning to my world. Before you, I was just existing, going through the motions. You taught me what it means to really live, to love with your whole heart, to build something that matters. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Abigail Tucker. We are the best thing that ever happened to each other," Abigail said, and kissed him as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to appear. They returned home to find the children had been perfect angels for Mrs. Henderson, who looked suspiciously well-rested for someone who had been watching 4 energetic children for 3 days. Benjamin confessed that he might have bribed his younger siblings with cookies to be on their best behavior, and Abigail and Yates just laughed and hugged all 4 of them, grateful for the family they had created together. More years passed, marked by the milestones of their children's lives. Benjamin fell in love with the daughter of a neighboring rancher and married her in a beautiful ceremony on the ranch. Anna met a young man who shared her love of baking, and they talked of opening a bakery together. Samuel went east to university, writing long letters home about his studies and his plans to return to Nebraska to practice law and help settlers with land disputes and legal matters. And Rose, true to her adventurous nature, announced that she wanted to start a horse breeding program on the ranch, focusing on the kind of strong, dependable horses that were essential to life on the prairie. When Abigail turned 45, she found herself pregnant again, much to everyone's surprise, including her own. The doctor in Fort Kearny, who had delivered all her other children, just shook his head and laughed, pronouncing her healthy enough for one more if that was what the Lord had in mind. "Another baby," Yates said, shaking his head in wonder. "I thought we were done with diapers and midnight feedings. Are you unhappy?" Abigail asked, searching his face for any sign of dismay. "Unhappy, not even a little bit. Every child is a blessing, and if we are meant to have another one, then I could not be more pleased, though I am a bit worried about you. You are not as young as you were with Benjamin." "I am not elderly either," Abigail said with a laugh. "Women have been having babies at 45 since the beginning of time. I will be fine." She was right. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and on a crisp autumn morning their last child was born. A boy, small but perfectly healthy, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's smile. "What should we name him?" Yates asked, cradling his youngest son with the practiced ease of a man who had done this before. "Hope," Abigail said. "I want to name him Hope." "That is not really a name for a boy," Yates said gently. "Then make it his middle name," Abigail said. "But it has to be part of his name, because he is proof that there is always hope, always a reason to keep going, always the possibility of new beginnings no matter how old we get or how hard things seem." "Thomas Hope Tucker," Yates said, trying it out. "I like it." And so Thomas Hope joined their family, the surprise blessing of their middle years, adored by his parents and older siblings alike. Benjamin's wife offered to help with the baby whenever Abigail needed a rest, and Anna often stopped by to bring meals or just to hold her baby brother. Samuel came home from university for the birth and stayed several weeks, unable to resist the pull of family. And Rose declared that Thomas would grow up to be the best horseman in Nebraska if she had anything to say about it. The ranch continued to prosper through it all. Yates had become one of the most respected ranchers in the state, known for his fair dealing and his commitment to sustainable practices that would keep the land healthy for generations. Abigail's business had grown beyond her wildest dreams, with her preserves and baked goods sold in stores throughout Nebraska, and even shipped to customers as far away as Denver and Kansas City. They built additions onto the house to accommodate their growing family and the occasional visits from their children, and eventually, their grandchildren. The front porch was expanded into a wide veranda where they could sit on summer evenings and watch the sun set over the land they had worked so hard to build into something meaningful. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party that brought together friends and neighbors from all over the county. There was music and dancing, and more food than even their large family could eat. As Abigail danced with Yates under the stars, surrounded by everyone they loved, she felt a contentment so deep and complete that it brought tears to her eyes. "What are you thinking about?" Yates asked, holding her close as they swayed to the music. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Abigail said. "How different my life would be if you had ridden past me that day instead of stopping. I would have frozen to death on that prairie, alone and believing I had nothing to live for. Instead, I have all this. You, our children, this beautiful life we have built together. It is more than I ever dreamed possible." "I am the lucky one," Yates insisted. "You could have turned me away, could have refused my help and gone back to face your grief alone. Instead, you trusted me. You let me love you. You built this life with me, and every single day I wake up grateful that you chose me." "I will always choose you," Abigail said. "In this life and whatever comes after. You are my home, Yates Tucker. You always will be." He kissed her then, a long, sweet kiss that made their children groan and their grandchildren giggle, but neither of them cared. They were lost in each other, just as they had been that winter day 25 years ago when he had held her while she cried and promised to fill her up. And he had kept that promise every single day, filling her life with love and purpose and joy beyond measure. As they grew older together, they settled into the comfortable rhythms of a long and happy marriage. They still worked the ranch, though they left more and more of the daily operations to Benjamin and his growing family. They traveled occasionally, taking the train to San Francisco once to visit Anna and her husband, who had indeed opened that bakery and were doing quite well for themselves. They went to Samuel's law office in Omaha and sat in the gallery to watch him argue a case before a judge, bursting with pride at the fine man their son had become. Rose remained at the ranch, developing her horse breeding program into one of the most respected in the state. She eventually married a cowboy who worked for the ranch, a quiet man who shared her love of horses and did not mind that his wife was better at breaking broncos than he was. And Thomas, their youngest, grew into a thoughtful, kind young man who inherited his mother's skill with plants and his father's patience. He took over the farm portion of their property, expanding the gardens and fields, experimenting with different crops, and eventually becoming known as one of the best farmers in the region. When Yates turned 60, he and Abigail decided it was time to truly retire. They signed over the ranch to Benjamin, who had been running it for years anyway, and moved into the small cottage on the edge of the property, the one Mrs. Henderson and her husband had lived in before they passed away. It was strange at first, living in a small house after so many years in the big one, but Abigail quickly came to love it. There was something peaceful about the cottage, something that invited rest and reflection. They spent their days in gentle pursuits, tending a small garden, reading, and most of all, simply enjoying each other's company. They became the beloved grandparents who always had cookies in the jar and stories to tell. The grandchildren loved to visit, climbing into their laps to hear tales of the old days, of how Grandma and Grandpa had met on a snowy prairie and fallen in love. "Tell us again about the day you met," one of Benjamin's daughters would beg, and Abigail and Yates would exchange a smile before launching into the story they had told so many times, but never tired of telling. "It was the coldest day of the year," Yates would begin, his voice taking on the cadence of a practiced storyteller. "And I was riding home when I saw a woman walking alone across the prairie, crying like her heart was breaking. 'What did you do, Grandpa?' The children would ask, even though they knew the answer. 'I stopped,' Yates would say simply, 'because you always stop to help someone in need, and I am glad I did because that crying woman became my whole world. She was crying in his winter arms,' Abigail would continue, taking up the story. 'And he held me tighter and said, "Cry until you are empty. I will fill you up," and he did. He filled my whole life up with love.' The children would sigh happily, satisfied with the tale, and run off to play, leaving Abigail and Yates sitting together on the porch, hands clasped, watching the sun set over the prairie that had brought them together all those years ago. "You think we will go together?" Abigail asked one evening, her head resting on Yates's shoulder. They were both in their late 70s now, their bodies worn from years of hard work, but their minds still sharp and their love still strong. "When we die, you mean?" Yates asked. "Yes. I do not want to live without you, Yates. I do not think I could bear it." "Then we will make a deal with the Lord," Yates said, pressing a kiss to her silvery hair. "We will ask him to take us together when the time comes, but not yet. We have a few more sunsets to watch together first." And they did. They had several more years of quiet contentment, surrounded by the family they had created and the love they had nurtured for more than 50 years. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary with a party even bigger than the one for their 25th, with children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren running around the ranch. 50 years, Abigail marveled, looking at the life they had built. It does not seem possible that it has been that long. The time flies when you are happy, Yates said, when you have someone you love by your side. That night, after all the guests had gone home and the house was quiet, they sat together on the porch of their cottage, wrapped in blankets against the February cold. It was almost exactly 51 years since the day Yates had found Abigail crying on the prairie, and they both felt the significance of the date. "I would do it all again," Abigail said softly. "Every moment, every hardship, every joy. I would choose this life, this love, over and over again." "So would I," Yates agreed. "You are the best decision I ever made, Abigail Tucker." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. And as they sat there, Abigail felt a deep peace settle over her, the knowledge that she had lived a good life, a full life, a life filled with love and purpose and joy. She had lost everything once, but she had found so much more in return. "Thank you for stopping that day," she whispered to Yates. "Thank you for not riding past. Thank you for trusting me," Yates whispered back. "Thank you for letting me love you." They were found the next morning by Benjamin, who had come to bring them breakfast as he often did. They were still sitting on the porch, wrapped in blankets, hands clasped together, peaceful expressions on their faces. They had passed away sometime in the night, together, just as they had asked, their hearts giving out within moments of each other after more than half a century of beating in tandem. The funeral was held on a bright spring morning, and it seemed like half the state came to pay their respects. The church could not hold all the people who wanted to honor the couple who had touched so many lives with their kindness and their love. They were buried together in the small cemetery overlooking the prairie, under a headstone that read simply, "Yates and Abigail Tucker. Together in life, together in death, together forever in love." Their children mourned them, but also celebrated the incredible life their parents had lived. They gathered at the ranch to go through the cottage, finding letters and mementos that told the story of a love that had endured through all the ups and downs of life on the prairie. Benjamin found a journal his mother had kept, and in it, an entry from the day after his parents had married. "I married Yates Tucker today, and I have never been happier. He found me when I was broken and lost, and he put me back together with patience and love. He promised to fill me up, and he has. My heart, once so empty, is now overflowing. I do not know what the future holds, but I know that as long as I have Yates by my side, I can face anything. He is my home, my heart, my everything." Benjamin read the entry aloud to his siblings, and they all wept, not just for the loss of their parents, but for the beauty of the love they had shared. It was a love that had created them, that had shaped them, that had taught them what it meant to truly care for another person. "They had something special," Anna said, wiping her eyes. "Not everyone gets that kind of love." "No," Benjamin agreed, "but they showed us it was possible. They taught us how to love, how to build a life with someone, how to weather storms together and come out stronger on the other side." "We are so lucky they found each other," Samuel added, "because if they had not, none of us would be here." Rose nodded, then smiled through her tears. "You know what Mom would say if she were here right now. She would tell us to stop crying and go live our lives. To take what they taught us and use it to build our own happiness." "She would be right," Thomas said. "The best way to honor them is to love the way they loved us, fully, completely, without holding back, and that is what they did." The children of Yates and Abigail Tucker carried on the legacy their parents had built, running the ranch with the same integrity and care, treating others with the same kindness and respect, and loving their own families with the same wholehearted devotion. They told their children stories about their grandparents, about the cowboy who stopped to help a crying woman on a winter prairie, and the love that grew from that single act of compassion. The ranch continued to thrive for generations, each new Tucker adding their own chapter to the story, while honoring the foundation that Yates and Abigail had built. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howled across the prairie and the snow fell thick and fast, the Tucker descendants would gather by the fire and remember the story of how it all began. How a woman who had lost everything found herself walking across a frozen prairie, crying as if her heart would break. How a cowboy riding home saw her and could not just pass by. How he dismounted and held her while she sobbed, not knowing her name or her story, but knowing only that she needed someone to hold her together while she fell apart. And how he had made her a promise that winter day, a promise that would shape both of their lives and the lives of all who came after them. "Cry until you are empty," he had said. "I will fill you up." It was a promise he had kept every single day for the rest of his life, filling her with love and joy and purpose. And in doing so, he had been filled up too, because that is how love works. When you give it freely, without reservation, it comes back to you multiplied beyond measure. The story of Yates and Abigail Tucker became a legend in that part of Nebraska, a reminder that even in the darkest moments when all seems lost, hope can find you. Love can find you. Someone can stop and help you when you need it most, and that single moment of compassion can change everything. And so the Tucker Ranch stood as a monument to their love, the land they had worked together, the home they had built, the family they had created. It stood as proof that one kind act on a cold winter day could ripple out across time, touching lives for generations to come. In the end, Yates and Abigail Tucker had done exactly what they set out to do. They had built a life worth living. They had loved each other with everything they had. And they had shown everyone who knew them what it meant to truly fill someone up, to take a heart that was empty and broken and fill it with so much love that it overflowed, spilling out to touch everyone around them. It was a legacy worth leaving, a story worth telling, a love worth remembering. And in the hearts of their children, grandchildren, and all who came after, Yates and Abigail Tucker lived on, forever together, forever in love, forever an example of what two people can build when they choose to face life side by side. The prairie wind still blew across the land they had called home, whispering through the grass like a song. And if you listened closely on a quiet winter evening, you might hear in that wind the echo of a promise made long ago, a promise that had transformed two lives and created something beautiful and lasting. "Cry until you are empty. I will fill you up." It was a promise that had been kept, a love that had endured, a story that would never be forgotten. And in the end, that was all anyone could hope for. To love and be loved, to build something meaningful, to leave the world better than they found it. Yates and Abigail Tucker had done all that and more. They had started with nothing but each other, two broken souls who found healing in love, and they had built an empire, not of wealth or power, but of family and legacy and enduring devotion. It was more than enough. It was everything. And their story, the story of the cowboy who stopped on a winter day and the woman whose tears he caught, lived on in the land they had loved, and the family they had created, a reminder that hope is always possible, that love can heal anything, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a single act of kindness on a cold Nebraska prairie.